Let me start by saying that I am really late to the party on this one. 8 years late to be exact. But before we get into that, let's start with a little background. I got a solid job offer in early 2020 that required me to move, and I had to say goodbye to a game that I'd been running for a year in my old neighborhood. Which was just as well since COVID started rolling in and all these social distance restrictions were popping up, so my live game was going to have to go on hiatus no matter what. One of my players gave me this cool pop-up card as a gift. Thank you, Donnie. This pop-up card rode with me in my laptop bag all the way to the East Coast so I wouldn't lose it. After a few months in my new home, I thought about what sort of game I wanted to run next. I had this idea where players would start out on a prison ship, arriving at a mysterious continent. The prison where they were housed had no walls and very few guards. What it did have, though, was a vast desert leading to an unexplored land. Prisoners were free to leave at any time and would be given a wooden staff and 2 days of rations and water if they chose to do so. But if they ever returned, they would be cut down by the guards' crossbows on sight. I thought this would make a good crossing the threshold moment for players. Players would discover mysterious civilizations whose inhabitants debated a prophesized event known as the Sundering. Then I realized I was just copying Morrowind and just set it aside for a while. My own efforts to find an online game as a player were equally frustrating. Games filled up quick, and I knew that if I wanted to play in any form, it was probably going to be as the game's organizer. Again. So what drove me to give Edge of the Empire a try? I'm not gonna lie, it was Mandalorian Season 2. Something about a space adventure distilled to a spaghetti western felt so much more like the original trilogy than anything else that had been produced lately. And so I picked up the book, and put up together an adventure. So how's this system work? Well, Edge of the Empire, along with its sibling books, Force and Destiny, and Age of Rebellion, and distant cousin Genesis, uses a narrative dice system. Player stats grant them a set of ability and proficiency dice. These, along with the occasional boost die, gives the player's rolls a variety of positive results such as successes, advantages, and triumphs. The GM requires the players to roll difficulty, challenge, and the occasional setback die alongside the ones granted to them by their stats. These produce negative results to offset the positives such as failures, threats, and despair. Additionally, the players and GM also have access to Destiny tokens. Each game's sessions opens with a roll to establish the distribution of light and dark. The players and GM can flip these from light to dark, and vice versa, to boost rolls or to adjust the narration in one way or another. This creates a constantly adjusting balance of power between the players in the game, where using the resource grants more power to the other side. So after 10 sessions, how would I compare Edge of the Empire with D&D 5th edition? The narrative dice system adds a lot of variety to player rolls, with advantage, threat, triumph, and despair having narrative effects that aren't strictly tied to the player's success or failure. And speaking of those symbols, I'd say that math takes a very different form in Edge of the Empire. While D&D involves a little addition and subtraction, especially for resolving attacks and summing up damage, Edge of the Empire requires little more than counting symbols. And it can get a little tedious counting and offsetting success versus failure, advantage versus threat, and then tacking on triumph or despair, which don't offset each other. However, there is a way to automate this in online games, which I'll talk about in a moment. There's a lot more chart reading in Edge of the Empire too, something that D&D went to some lengths to reduce in 5th edition. The gear and weapon lists feel more like something from Saga Edition or 3 and 3.5 D&D, with a huge range of tags and effects that have to be consulted, sometimes on separate pages of lists. Edge of the Empire is more streamlined for a Theater of the Mind style game though, with ranges represented abstractly, long, medium, short, close, extreme, etc. You don't even need maps, though the beginner game comes with some to reference. It actually works better for online games. D&D is very specific about ranges, and players accustomed to precise wargame style map play don't always enjoy having the impact of their tactics decided by the GM, rather than the strict rules of the map. Speaking of combat and tactics, Edge is also significantly more lethal than D&D. A bad streak of luck in one direction or the other can put a player character in the hospital or a quick grave, or bring a campaign arc to a swift end if the villain is captured or killed, sometimes in as few as 3 turns. And that brings me to the final gameplay difference I'll highlight. After playing the two systems for a bit, I find that D&D creates more of a game about resource management, as players consider the recharge time of their various spells and class abilities in each encounter. Edge is more about risk management, with the decision to take a risk not only having a chance of success versus failure, but compounding narrative effects as well. What's it like to GM a game of Edge of the Empire? For starters, you are in charge of most of the narrative effects. Now, some equipment and talents give players the option of choosing an effect, but much of the time you have to improvise these yourself, especially for roles with threat and despair. You're also in charge of player obligations, something chosen during character creation. Each session begins with an obligation roll to see if any player's background is going to come into play during the session. This makes background development between the player and GM more important in Edge, as the GM has to come up with a plausible way to include the background in the session. This can be difficult, especially if you play shorter sessions. But one helpful area for the GM is the Star Wars setting itself. While fantasy offers a wide open range of possibilities, a pre-existing shared experience between the players and GM helps set the expectations about the setting. So if players and GM choose to build their expectations around the original trilogy, or the Old Republic games, or the now Legends Thrawn trilogy, chances are they have a slightly more unified idea of what to expect in the game. Much of Star Wars media has had a fairly consistent tone as well, with some exceptions, and with mixed results. But that consistency gives the GM a valuable shortcut to help establish the setting for the players. Now, how would I rate the handbook itself? Off the bat, let me just say that Fantasy Flight had some problems writing rulebooks for their games back when Edge was published, something that they've fixed since then. But Edge of the Empire was published in 2013 when there was still a bit of a struggle, and it kind of shows. Fantasy Flight's books have always had great art though, and it continued with Edge, although there are a few recycled samples of Ralph McQuarrie's prototype images, but you could do a lot worse than that. As I mentioned before, there's also a lot of table reading as well as flipping back and forth to iron out one thing or another, especially when it comes to the variety of effects available to the players in the gear section. As a forever GM, I have to admit that there's a lot of overhead during gameplay and prep. The obligation system requires a fair bit of prep, and shorter sessions can make it difficult to look for a way to fit obligation events into the game, especially if a session takes place in a relatively deserted setting. You also have to be on your toes for any narrative results that come up during die rolls. And every single skill has a short list of suggested effects. I ended up having to come up with my own chart as a way to help resolve these quickly, and that's just one of many charts I had to make to streamline narrative effects. But part of the fun of narrative effects is that it makes the game more of a game for the GM too. Advantage and threat mean that some of the game's direction isn't wholly up to the GM. If you can move the stories current with the flow established by the dice, it can take you in some fun directions. Edge is also a good system if you're tired of map prep. I've done map prep for both electronic maps and dry erase maps. And while players appreciate a well-prepared map, it's nice being able to establish combat space just by a general outline and a creative sprinkling of abstract complications. I have some criticisms of the Destiny mechanic. While it is neat that the two sides of a game have a shared resource, there isn't as much back and forth in the 3-hour sessions that I run. But the weirdest thing about Edge is that somehow Fantasy Flight made a game in 2013 that plays better on Discord, a social media platform that wasn't introduced until 2015. When used in conjunction with RPG Sessions bot, the rote counting of symbols is eliminated, and the result is just displayed alongside the dice. And this gives you a handy way to record your sessions as well, giving a chime and a display with each roll to show what the game group is responding to. It's easier to find players these days than ever as well, especially after the second season of Mandalorian came out. Quite a few have also migrated from Saga editions in D20 as well. As for house rules, I only have 2 suggestions, one of which I decided on before starting my current campaign, and the other one was developed during gameplay with the players. The first is in regards to the obligation roll at the start of the game. I do this roll in secret and simply declare to the players if an obligation has been triggered or not, and reduce their stress threshold for the session accordingly, but I don't reveal whose obligation has been triggered. This way players know that an obligation is going to happen, but they don't know whose, creating delectable tension. But when the individual player's obligation actually comes into the story, I reduce their stress threshold further. The other house rule is one more for humor, built between my players and I. We decided that a critical hit roll of 66 actually counts as 100, in honor of Order 66. Good times. That's all I have for this video. I'll get back to Nick and his friends soon enough. Thanks for watching. See you next time.